Howdy, Internet. So, how to use your prep time. You only have 15 minutes, so that's not a lot of time, typically. And depending on your position, there are different things you want to do. Some positions in the debate, you basically get extra prep time during the debate. So if you're in back half, you have the whole front half to prepare, whereas if you're in first proposition, you're speaking after just 15 minutes. So the first suggestion I have, and this is potentially something that seems obvious, but is frequently ignored by debaters, is to be ready to actually prepare during the 15 minutes. During the term of today, I have absolutely no doubt that you will see many of your colleagues using their prep time to search for the washroom or to refill their water bottle. That is time that you have specifically devoted to preparing. So you don't want to waste any of it. So go to the washroom before prep starts, get all your notes, get your paper ready, have a pen before prep time begins. You don't want to waste any of your valuable time searching for those things. That is especially important if you are in the opening half of the debate, because every minute that you have in those positions is quite precious for preparing. So I guess we'll start out with what some more general pieces of advice for using prep time. And these are not the correct, quote-unquote, way to do prep, because there is no correct way or incorrect way. But these are just a bunch of suggestions, that I have from experience. The first is, no matter what position you're in, to not immediately start talking with your partner about the resolution. You're going to have a length of time where you have to walk from wherever the motion is released to your room where you're debating. If, for instance, the motion is released in F227 in a couple hours, and you're debating in this room, you're going to have quite a long time. You're going to have a walk, a few minutes anyhow. And my advice is, don't say anything to your partner during that time. Independently try to think of arguments. And the reason for that is that sometimes if people start speaking right away, they can get very, very excited about one particular type of argument, one particular thought of the debate, one particular perspective on the resolution, and lose sight of everything else. And that's much less likely to happen if both members of the team are independently thinking for a few minutes, because you'll probably develop at least somewhat differing perspectives or have different arguments from each other. So you're less likely to end up going through far too narrow an approach if you both brainstorm. It also gives you the benefit that you're likely to come up with a broader variety of arguments. And that's useful in any team in the debate. It's particularly useful for closing meetings, where there's a chance that many of your arguments will be taken by the teams in front of you in your opening opposition. So you want to have a variety of arguments that you can draw from the debate. So once you've done kind of brainstorming sessions, the first thing you do is think about it independently, get to your room. I would always say there are some people who like to prepare near the GA and then walk to their room. I've never really understood that. I think as soon as the motion is released, you go to your room and prepare nearby. And so you walk there, you probably don't say much to each other on the way there. Then once you've had a couple minutes to think, you brainstorm together, you write down all of your different arguments. There's no need to write down arguments that you thought of that were the same. But if, for instance, you came up with 3 arguments, and you came up with 3 arguments, but 2 of them were the same, then you have 4 arguments. Because you have the 2 that were common, and then you have your unique argument and your unique argument. So that gives you kind of an array of arguments to choose from. And something that I think you should, those steps are all things that I think you should do regardless of what position you're in. That should be the start of your prep. But at this point, I think it makes sense to branch off into what you do in different positions. So if you're in opening government, that makes the most sense because both because it's the most complicated to prepare for and because it's the chronologically first of the debate. Once you have kind of a baseline of what arguments you want to make, you have some idea of what those are going to be, you should try to come up with any definitions or model that you need. And that, obviously, as you learned this week, can range from very simple to very complicated. This house supports time and parenting, doesn't require extensive thought of definitions and models. This house believes the West should recognize Georgia and South Ossetian independence, probably requires a much more extensive model or definition. So, before you flush out your arguments, I think if you're an opening argument, you should decide on the definition of the model. Because your arguments should flow from it. The substance, the meat of what you want to say, should be aimed at demonstrating why your model will solve the problem that you identify. And that can't really happen if you don't know what the problem is and know what your solution is. So in coming up with a definition of a model, hopefully you'll identify some problem with the world, or some value to support anyway, if it's a values debate. And then a solution, or a means of recognizing that value as being superior. And then, once you come up with a model and a definition that you like, you'll go back to your arguments. And you'll see, of the four that you came up with, do they all make sense in the context of your model and your definition? Now this is important because it's where teams sometimes get lost. They come up with arguments, and they come up with a definition of the model, independent of one another, and then they don't realize until the round is already happening that some of their arguments don't actually match up with the definition or model that they've provided. And that's a big problem. So the first thing you want to do once you have your definition or your model is make sure that your arguments actually all align with that. Make sure your arguments are about the model you've decided. And then the second thing you want to do with regards to flushing out your arguments is decide which speaker is going to make which arguments. Now, in practice, this usually means that the Prime Minister just decides which arguments they want to give, and then the second speaker gets the others. That is not an optimal way of assigning arguments. It makes a lot of sense from a kind of team cohesion perspective, because the Prime Minister has to speak first, so let's let them take the good stuff because they need to speak very quickly. They have, like, at this point, 4 or 5 minutes left to prepare. So it can make sense, or it can seem to make sense, to let them have whatever arguments they want. But what I think you should do is take another moment, and it doesn't have to be more than 30 seconds or a minute. And if you debate for a bit of a long time, get some experience, it'll become really obvious to you which of those 4 arguments, or 3 or 5, or however many you have, which of those arguments are the most important. And put those ones in the first speech. Because those are the arguments that you want to be talked about the most, that you want to get the most credit for talking about. And hopefully you want to prove to the judges, not only are they correct, but they're most important. And one of the best ways to signal to a judge that you think an argument is important in the front half of the debate is to put it in your first speech. To an exceptionally good judge, that shouldn't matter. Arguments should be given the same weight regardless of when they appear in the opening half of the debate. There's no reason why a second speaker can't make a really, really good and important argument. But for a lot of judges who are either lazy or inexperienced or don't understand that, it can be very helpful to make sure that all of the arguments that you think are really important go in that first speech. So at this point, you brainstormed, you came up with your definition of your model, you've split up your arguments into the first and second speeches. Now you have to start flushing them out. And hopefully, if you've been efficient, you have at least 5 minutes, probably 7 or 8 minutes, to start on this. And being able to put a lot of meat onto an argument in the Prime Minister's speech is one of the most important skills in debating. I'm going to give a lecture in the next section on how to win from open government. But that is a skill that a lot of debaters don't master. So if you're able to use your prep time effectively and build good arguments in that Prime Minister's speech, you'll be well on your way. And one way that I think you can do that is, I'm not going to say that you ignore the arguments of the second speaker during your prep time, but that you focus both of your energies on building arguments that are going to come out of the Prime Minister's speech. So if the Prime Minister is going to have 3 arguments, I would say that you should spend almost all of your remaining prep time, both of you, building those arguments. And there are, of course, many strategies to do that, but thinking about different actors in the debate, different perspectives, all the things you learn all week. But just from a prep time perspective, I think most of the rest of your prep time should be devoted to the Prime Minister's speech, because it's really important. And because the Deputy Prime Minister, the second speaker, knows what the Prime Minister is going to say. And hopefully, you can trust your partner enough to deliver the speech that you prepared as a team. And that means that while your partner is speaking, obviously you want to be listening in case there's POIs that you need to deal with, or they say something that's not quite the way you intended it, but that you can focus most of your attention during the Prime Minister's speech on building up your own arguments for that second speaker. Because you remember how we spend most of our time in prep building Prime Minister's arguments. Now, you as the Deputy Prime Minister can use the Prime Minister's speech as an additional 7 minutes of prep time to build your own argument, or arguments, however many you have. And I think that is a really efficient way to use your prep time as like the open government team. Does that make sense? Are there questions? No? That does not make sense, or there are no questions? Okay. So that's OG. Opening opposition is largely the same. I think you should spend roughly the same allocation of time, except obviously somewhat less to definitions and modeling, because you're not the team that is going to be responsible for that. But what you might want to think about instead is what the model might be, because that should frame many of your arguments as well. Now, obviously, you don't have control of that as the opposition, but you can usually predict fairly well what kind of model and definition you're going to get and prepare arguments accordingly. The one kind of difference, I think, between opening government and opening opposition is that the deputy leader of opposition can't really use the leader of opposite speech as prep time for their own constructive arguments, because they have to be thinking of responses to the opening government material, they're going to need responses to the Deputy Prime Minister material, and they're going to need to note what the leader of the opposition said in response to the Prime Minister. So you don't know all of what's going to be in your partner's speech. So you can't, to the same extent, use their speech as prep time. So you'll want to spend more time in the actual preparation block flushing out second speaker arguments for opening opposition. But the comment I made about spending time independently thinking of arguments and then brainstorming still absolutely holds true for opening opposition as well. You want to be spending at least 2 or 3 minutes doing that so that you don't get focused down the wrong path, so you come up with a variety of arguments. That's kind of the front half. It's a little bit different for opposing teams, because you have far more time before you have to deliver a speech. You get 15 minutes of prep, and then half an hour during the debate. And obviously, you want to be paying attention during the debate, because you want to know what you have to rebuild, what you can't say as an extension because the opening team took it, what the important issues in the front half of the debate are. But you can still kind of cheat and use that time for flushing out arguments, because it will not all be wonderfully compelling stuff in the opening half. And so, the changes that I would suggest making in how you use prep time are roughly as follows. I think in the back half, you use more of your prep time for individual thinking. I would say like 5 minutes at least. And that's because you really need to come up with lots of arguments. If you're a back half team and you walk in on the round with only 3 ideas for what your arguments can be, it's quite likely that the opening half team may take all of them. And then you're screwed. Maybe you're not screwed, maybe you're just panicking. You're certainly going to have to make something up on the fly. You're going to have to improvise, which usually means that you'll be less prepared and do less good of a job. So, if you spend more time independently thinking of arguments, you're likely to have more ideas. And that's important in back half. And so once you have your ideas, it is less important in back half, though you should still do it, to try to understand what the model is going to be. So do the same kind of guessing game that I told opening opt-in, and try to figure out what the model is. You obviously have far more time to react if the model is something crazy, because you have half an hour to figure out what it means. But you'll still want to spend a little bit of time thinking about it, because you want your arguments to drive the heart of what the debate you think is going to happen. And so once you have brainstormed together your arguments and you thought something of what the debate is going to be as a general concept, you'll have some time that you can start building your arguments. And I would suggest picking the ones, not necessarily that you think are the most important, but the ones that you think you are most likely to get to offer as an extension. So if you have 4 arguments, and you think 3 of them are really important, but pretty obvious, and your 4th one is pretty important, but not at all obvious, I would focus most of my time preparing the 4th argument, because you're far more likely to be able to use that in the debate. Also, as a general rule, though this is not obviously a hard and fast rule, arguments that are more obvious, that are more kind of transparently clear that they're going to be part of the debate, are usually arguments that you can build more easily. Because everybody in the debate will have thought about it. So they tend to be easier to build. For instance, to use the debate of this house supports tiger parenting. If one of the arguments you came up with during the brainstorming was, this will improve children's academic performance, which will help them get into university. Pretty obvious argument for that motion. Let's say the opening outcome team forgot to make it, or they made it very bad. You probably don't need a lot of time in the debate to flush out that argument, because you can make the logical steps. You can make your notes on that argument fairly quickly. So I would say to prepare the argument you think is most likely to be used in extension, and then spend the rest of your time on arguments that you think the opening government team might take. Does that make sense? Okay. The other important thing about back half, and this is something that I think is really important, is I get asked all the time, how do I know what the clashes are? Or how do I know what my speech should be about? How can I figure out what's important? And that process should start during prep time. If you're the whip speaker, maybe while the extension speaker building one of your arguments, you can take a couple of minutes just to think about what you think the important clash of the debate is. And you should have at least some preconceived idea before you go into the debate about what that's going to be. Now, obviously, if the debate that happens is very, very different, you can't use what you thought about. But most of the time, that won't be true. And so most of the time, you'll have given yourself a really good head start on building your own speech. So I think that's important as well. Are there any questions about the various teams of the debate and how I think we should use prep time?
Yeah, about opening government.
Yeah.
I taught that the member of the government, the opening that
Sorry, you mean the deputy prime minister?
Prime Minister.
Okay.
The Prime Minister need to just make the declaration of topic first, and then give the argument. So maybe he doesn't have that time for the argument, and maybe he can remember his one. So what about his partner? His partner should do others to support him. But as you just mentioned, that the partner should help him to prep in the prep time. So what about the partner's point?
So for the opening government team, I think the first thing you focus on is, as with any team, what the outline of your argument is going to be. Then you build a definition or a model. Then you flesh out the Prime Minister's arguments. You're right that nowhere in there did I say you should build the Deputy Prime Minister's arguments. And if you feel like you need to, it's okay to take a couple of minutes towards the end of the prep time, for the Deputy Prime Minister to start building their own arguments. But I think that's suboptimal, because the Deputy Prime Minister, as I said, has 7 minutes when they are reasonably sure what's going to be said, because you just prepared it. The Prime Minister doesn't have to respond. The Prime Minister can almost write their speech. I mean, they don't have enough time to do that. But they can have a very clear idea of what they're going to say. So it won't be a surprise to the Deputy Prime Minister. So that can be used as additional prep time for him. So that's when I think it is the best time for the Deputy Prime Minister to focus exclusively on their arguments. That's not to say they shouldn't think about it during prep. Because if you have spare time, if you have extra time, then absolutely. But as a team activity, I think the team is better off if both speakers focus during the prep time on making that first speech as good as it can be. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
And how about the model? Should the first speaker make or the second one make?
Both. In fact, that's an excellent question, and it's why some debates or some teams go terribly, terribly haywire. If the Prime Minister is the only person responsible for building the model, first of all, it's unlikely that, so I don't know how I want to say this. You can get away with it. Sometimes it'll be fine. But it will go wrong a lot more often than if the team builds it together. For the first reason, that 2 minds are better than 1. It is far more likely that one person thinking in isolation will get something terribly wrong than if 2 people independently think about it. Okay? And secondly, if the Prime Minister prepares the definition of the model entirely on their own, how can the Deputy Prime Minister help them with their arguments? Because you don't know what the motion, you don't know what the model is. So you might provide input on those arguments that is not relevant to the model that your team is going to advance. So it is always advisable, I think, and this is one of very few things I will say that is a declarative statement, that both speakers should always prepare their model together. Okay? One last thing that I forgot forgot to say earlier. In addition to going to the washroom, going to your room, being ready before prep starts, you should know which order you're going to be speaking. It is a waste of time for you to spend 2 or 3 minutes arguing with your partner about who's going to speak first, who's going to understand, who's going to whip. That is something, I mean, if you want to have that argument, fine. But have that argument before the 15-minute clock starts ticking. Right? The only instance where I would say that you should have an exception is if it's a motion that one person knows a great deal about. So, let's say I am an international relations student. I'm not. Let's say I am. And my partner is a women's studies major. And the motion is, I don't have a motion off the top of my head because I picked those examples out of thin air. But let's say the motion is something about feminism. Even if I usually speak first, it probably makes more sense for my partner, who knows a lot more about the topic, to go first in that particular case. Especially if it will be very difficult to communicate all of the arguments to me during the prep time. Okay?
What about the closing argument or the closing accusation? Does the witness need to do more?
In those cases, I think the person with substantially more knowledge should always exist. And the reason for that is because if you don't, and being the Luddite that I am, I'm not up to speed on, I like to think that I'm fairly well versed, but I'm certainly no expert in feminism or LGBT issues or anything else in that discipline of study. It's quite likely that I will make arguments that are relatively simple, and then the whip speaker will have lots more knowledge and make the argument so much better. But at that point, it's kind of new material. So usually, if there's a significant knowledge gap, the person with more knowledge should speak first. But that is a decision that should be made before you leave GA. So the motion goes up, and you'll know this when you see it, that in the vast majority of cases, you stay as you intended to speak. Whoever was intending to speak first will speak first. If you're going to switch before you even start walking around. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, and very, very importantly, it can often be tempting, but do not have the argument with your partner about who's going to speak first during the prep time. It's a waste of time. I think it makes people debate worse anyway. So those are kind of the various teams of the debate. Questions about that?
There happen once that in a prep time we think about the same point, but when we reach this point, the judge didn't buy it, and they say that he thinks that it's kind of waste of time to tell so much about it, but we all come up with it. So how can we avoid this?
So just make sure I'm getting this clearly. You all came up with an argument, you and your partner. You built the argument, made the argument, and the judge just didn't buy it.
And we think it's important, so we received it at first.
So you thought it was important, you said it first, and the judge didn't buy it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, two things might have happened. The first is that the argument may not have been as important as you thought it was. And that can happen. That is a reason why it's good to have many different arguments. Okay? And if that's the case, I think that's one thing where having two people independently think about arguments can help to weed out arguments that one person thinks are really important, but the other person doesn't. You both thought this argument was important. And so you built it, you put it first. So one of two things happened. Either you had a disagreement with the judge about the role of that argument in the debate. So really, really important and the judge didn't. Or the judge thought he didn't make the argument well enough. That the reason he wasn't buying it is because it wasn't well enough explained. And not being in the debate, I have no way of knowing which that was. But it was one of those two outcomes. The way to avoid the first one is to try as best you can to make sure that you are making the relevance and impacts of your argument as clear as possible. And the way to avoid the second issue of, I just didn't think you made the argument, is to build up the argument as much as you can. Okay, so those are the two solutions. I'm not sure which one it was. What was the, if you don't mind, what was the actual debate and argument question?
It's about the internet. The one that the internet should be free information.
Yep.
And we think that for this topic, we should talk about the importance of internet first. Then we bring it up and present it right.
Okay, so I think that was almost certainly the second category. The judge didn't think you had enough explanation to justify why you thought the internet was so important. Because clearly, if you establish that the internet is sufficiently important that people need to have access to it in order to live full lives, in order to be equal members of society, if you show that, then it's obviously a pretty important argument. So I think it was very likely that the judge just didn't think that you built up the argument well enough. Okay? Other questions? I do have another section to get to, but we have time. So.
What about the topic that we're not familiar with, such as this morning the topic about that we're confused as a little bit married to 5 years is the 5 years is at least 5 years or the much more than 5 years. We are confused that so we just ignore it and we just focus on other things such as prolong or the old possible grades about this, and we are really terrible at prepared for the topic we're not familiar with.
Okay, so the first thing you should know is that I do not think you were alone. I have not yet talked to a judge that thought their round this morning went well. And as I said in my debate when I was judging, it's a very difficult motion. I think I really don't want to turn this into a discussion about specific motion, but Oscar and I will. So I think a lot of people were confused by what the motion meant. Like, forget how it happened today. I think a lot of people just didn't understand the motion. And so, as I understand it, and as all of the instructors understood, the resolution means that when you get married, after 5 years, your marriage is automatically over. And that's all it meant. It didn't mean that you couldn't get divorced for 5 years. It didn't mean that after you decided at 5 years that you want to stay married, that you stay married forever. It didn't mean any of that.
In that topic is including the prolong that if all are separate, they can prolong their marriage. It doesn't mean that after 5 years, if the couple wants to be together, they can always be together.
It means they can be together for another 5 years.
So it's
And then 5 years down the line, they can decide for another 5 years. And then 5 years down the line, they decide for another 5 years. I think a lot of people made that mistake. It might have been worth it.
Including our judge. He didn't notice that we all talk in the wrong way. We as government and our opposition just talk it. We just talk about it as it will permanently or just stop after 5 years.
So actually, that's not entirely fair. Because if the definition and model was that after 5 years you make a decision for the rest of your life, and then nobody challenged it in the debate, like everybody in the debate just kind of went with it, then the judge has to go with it too. They can't say, I thought we were supposed to have a debate this way, and so first crowd loses. If nobody calls you on it, if if nobody says this is clearly not what the motion intended, then the judge just has to, judge accordingly. It's not, judges don't have that much freedom. If they can say, I know that's wrong, so you lose. Goodness knows many judges wish they could do that. But they do not actually have that power. At least they shouldn't. Some judges take it for themselves anyway, but they are bad judges. The second thing about the motion this morning is that you need to be very careful about who it applies to and what it does to them. Because even in a society with rising divorce rates, most people get married and want to stay married forever. Okay, things happen, they get divorced. But for most people, they want to stay married forever. And so at the 5-year mark, they'll just say, yes, we'd like to stay married. And then 5 years, yes, we'd like to stay married. And for those people, this resolution has very little effect. Okay?
But this solution is not just focused on them.
No, I know. Oh, I know. There are other groups of people as well. So there are people who might be, who are very, very unhappy, who get married, and 2 years later, this is not for me. He's a cad. She's having an affair. He lost his job. The bank's taking the house. This is a nightmare. Those people can still get divorced.
During the 5 years.
During the 5 years. The motion doesn't say anything about taking away divorce. If you're first go, you should never argue to take away divorce. That's very bad for a lot of reasons. Against a good opposition team, you'll lose.
The definition that we made that in 5 years, people should be with each other together during this marriage.
This motion went so awry. Okay.
And the opposition didn't write.
And again, if the opposition team doesn't call you on it, the judge just accepts it as true.
Because they are confused.
Yes. So, if you want to get divorced after 2 years, I'm talking in an ideal world now, where, definition is provided. But, so to be clear, all the instructors thought this was one way, and all the students thought it was another way. So maybe there was something in the wording of the motion, I'm not sure. But to talk about for a second my interpretation, the couples who are, just it's not working after 2 years, they can still get divorced. So this doesn't affect them either.
So what is talking about?
This affects people who are kind of vaguely unhappy, but not unhappy enough to get a divorce. Because if this isn't in place, they have no reason to reevaluate their marriage or their life decisions. But with this motion, every 5 years, they have to positively affirm, I want to be married. Okay? So it affects those people. There is a fourth group of people that I think are very, very important. And that is people who don't want to get a divorce because of the cultural stigma associated with it. But for whom the marriage is not particularly working. They don't dislike their partner. They don't want to have a long, acrimonious fight in court. But they prefer that the marriage end. And for those people, this is a way to get out. So let's say one partner has received a job offer from a bank in the United States and moved to New York. But they have a child here. So the family dynamic is very, very weird. Neither party might want to file for a divorce because that's a very significant step for someone to take. But if the marriage automatically ends, it's a different conversation about should we renew this marriage versus should we end this marriage. Do you see see why that's a little bit of, it's subtle, but it's a different kind of issue. So it affects those people as well.
So it's different from getting divorced. It's just like their marriage is not that miserable, but it's not happy enough for them to last forever.
Yes.
But this definition is narrow. It's not easy to talk about.
So this is why I said it was a difficult motion. Intentionally so. Like, it was by design. It was meant to be kind of a challenge before the tournament. I don't think we realized quite how challenging it would be as it actually turned out. But it was good that everyone had to think about it and get feedback on it. Hopefully we'll have all learned something. I believe I have 12 minutes left. So I want to say one thing that is kind of actually about that, not that specific motion, but it's more general. And that is, very often, debaters will get a motion, and they'll have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. They don't know what the motion means, they don't know what the words are, they have no idea. And it's one of the most common questions I'm asked. And if it wasn't just the two of you, if it was a whole room full of people, I'm sure somebody would have asked by now, what do I do if I know nothing about the motion? And the first answer is don't panic. That is much easier said than done, but it is impossible to think cogently and logically when your brain is racing. I'm so screwed, I'm so screwed, I'm so screwed, I have nothing, I have nothing. That's not a helpful thought. That's not a thought that will help you build an argument. It's not a thought that will help you decide what the debate is about. It's just destructive waste of time. So as much as I understand why people have that reaction, it's totally helpful. The first thing you should do is look for terms in the motion that you do understand. So, I'm trying to think of a motion that is relatively likely to be unknown to you. This House would abolish Aboriginal reservations. Do you know what those are?
What are reservations?
Aboriginal people.
What does that mean?
Okay, so you're allowed, this is actually a great example. So,
It's good thing if it's allowed to just look up into the dictionary while you're over here.
so you're always allowed a dictionary. Although I would recommend just asking the chief adjudicator. In this case, asking Tuna for the definition of the word. You're always allowed to ask for the definition of the word. So in this case, Aboriginal reserves are places in North America and Australia where people who were there before Europeans have been given that land. And on that land, they are their own society. They write their own laws, they pay their own taxes, they often don't pay don't pay taxes to the central government. They have virtually unlimited hunting and fishing rights. The idea is to let them live as much as we reasonably can, like they did before the Europeans came. Or to give them a place that is free from the kind of cultural oppression that exists in the rest of society. Does that make sense? So you're allowed to go ask the CA, if you don't know what the words mean, to go ask for a definition. You're always allowed to do that. And I suspect from your reaction here that you don't know much about these things, do you? Okay. So, how might you go about building a case on this motion? I'll start us off. The reservation makes them distinct or away from the rest of society. Okay? Do you think you can make an argument that taking people away from the rest of society is bad?
Not sure.
Not sure. Yeah. So it depends on how well you know. And you're always going to be better off with knowledge. But looking for parts of the motion that you recognize and you can make arguments from are going to be helpful. So in this case, for instance, you can say, well, these are people that have had lots of wrongs done to them historically. That's true. We treated them very, very, very badly. And this is a way of attempting to make it up to them. So your goal as a team that is in favor of the motion, again, about getting rid of reserves, you know you're going to have to establish, or try to establish, that we are not meeting that goal, that the reserves are bad. And so one way you might do that is by arguing that taking them away from society is unhelpful, right? Because that's something, when you get the definition of a reserve, you're going to know what that is. So you're going to know that segregation is not the answer. And I'm sure you can think of examples of segregation being really bad. Okay? The second thing, and this requires a little bit of knowledge, but that when we made the reservations, we didn't, for the most part, put them anywhere useful. So the economic conditions have not improved. There is still extensive poverty. Okay? So there's always things you can think about. To use a different notion, for instance, this house believes regional trading blocks are preferable to global free trade. Too hard to remember. Okay. So, even if you know nothing about, world economics, you can make an argument about why, if everything is totally free, big countries are going to punish smaller countries. Because that's what they do. They take advantage of their size to win global position. Is it time's up? The big countries can use their size and their advantages to prey on smaller countries. And so a regional bloc can help them stand up to that big country. Okay? And you can make various arguments about how if you have a region, that most of those countries are probably going to have similar types of economies. So they'll probably benefit from similar policies. Okay? So you can try to look for parts of the resolution that are general and build arguments from them. It's not a good substitute for having a lot of knowledge. You're going to be at a disadvantage. But it's better than throwing up your hands in panic. The other thing is that you can usually, if you're certainly in the back half, but even if you're opening opposition, gain a lot of knowledge from what the other teams are saying. Maybe not in the debate this morning, it seems that everybody had it wrong. But in other debates, the other teams might know more than you, which does put you at a disadvantage. But you can use their knowledge and the information they provide and build that into your own arguments. Use it with different logic to make a different point. Okay? Does all that make sense?
Yes.
Perfect. Are we almost out of time? I think we are.
We're going to sit here.
Yeah, we're about 5 minutes left. So I have time to take any questions that you have.
We can start at the opening government, because one thing that our closing government is not here, so we have to play two roles. But we really did a good job as a closing government instead of the opening one. So
See, that truly baffles me. If you are the same team, why you would do better in closing than opening?
I couldn't know either.
That's tough. I don't know.
So we had to listen to your second class
Okay.
about opening government.
Okay. Well, we'll start that one in about 4 minutes or so once we see if more people show up.
All right.
Okay? I think if you want to just stop the camera, you can start that.